Thank you, Kuba. I should probably say Dzień dobry to you all. Was that correct?
Almost.
Almost. Good. Well, I don't know if anyone else remembers the famous Monty Python sketch where someone makes a fake English-Bulgarian dictionary, and it's lots of rude words. And I'm always worried when I use the internet to research languages that that's going to happen. So I'm glad that that didn't happen in this case. Thanks, Kuba, for the introduction, and thank you for setting the scene. I'm going to try and talk a little bit about my own thinking and my own experiences around public participation with a particular focus on healthcare. But I'll try and keep it I'm going to do sort of 3 segments and break for questions in between, so hopefully it won't be too much like a formal conversation. So formal presentation, maybe it'll be more like listening to someone eccentric ramble on and then pause for breath. I think this is really exciting. What I'm going to talk about is first 3 examples of public engagement in healthcare and why I think they have a really important lessons for us about where we need to go in the future. I am then going to talk about how do we support participation more broadly? How do we make this part of everyone's business? How do we make this, as we say in England, business as usual? It's no longer new and exciting. We don't talk about it as something different. It's just the way we do things. And at the end, I thought I would list a few projects that I find personally very exciting. But I put them at the end purposefully so that if we get into a really good discussion in one of the Q&A sessions, then we can cut that bit and have a good conversation, participative conversation instead. I thought I'd say just a few things about Involve. We're celebrating 10 years this year. We're an NGO, a not-for-profit, based in London. And I was there when we were being set up, so I've been with them the whole journey. The reason Involve was set up was because in the UK, in the 70s, there was a lot of talk about political participation. And then the 80s came and the Thatcher era, and that all kind of died away. So there was a growing recognition that in the late 90s, when people started talking more about this, that we can't take political participation for granted. We can't take these reforms for granted. There needs to be someone there to make the case, to build the evidence, to show what's working and also importantly what's not working, because this is an experimental field. So Involve is there to try and connect researchers and doers and decision makers, all to reconnect citizens with the institutions they work with. I'm really privileged to be able to come to these international conferences and learn from experiences elsewhere. So really looking forward to talking to you in this session and also over lunch and in other sessions. But I'm not going to talk much more about Involve. Instead, let's talk about the big picture. This quote from Robert Hutchins, the American political thinker, I think is very important. The danger democracy faces today is not the danger of the 1920s and 30s. It's not violent decapitation, necessarily. The danger is death by 1,000 cuts. The danger is consistently low turnouts, declining members of political parties, increasing apathy, a decreased sense of political agency. Nothing I do makes any difference. Some academics talk about post-democracy. They say we live in a world where political decisions make no difference. We have the sort of trappings of democratic choice, but it doesn't feel relevant to people. And this is where I think political participation engagement comes in. Because the old way of organizing a democracy is beginning to creak. It's beginning to break at the seams, and the between elections democracy gives us an opportunity to inject new lifeblood into the democratic system. So I think that's the big picture, the big reason we're seeing these changes is we are faced by problems which we all created. We're all part of the problem of climate change. We're all part of the problem of demographic change, if the fact that we're all living longer can be seen as a problem. But it's not, in the past, a lot of the problems the state faced were ones that the state could solve from a top-down way. And those problems are fewer and fewer. Instead, we have to solve the problems together. And that's especially true in healthcare, which I'll get onto in a moment. But first, I just wanted to mention another case that I worked on. If I was a politician and I went to election on a platform of raising the age of retirement, how many of you would vote for me? That's a strong account there. If I went to election on a platform of reducing the quality of public services in healthcare and schools and other things, how many people would vote for me? Again, not exactly a great support. This is statistics from the island of Jersey in the English Channel. And we did some work on the aging society there a number of years ago. Jersey is really interesting because while it's an island of 100,000 people, it's also sovereign. It prints its own money, it sets its own policies. So in a way, it's kind of like this weird micro state. It's an opportunity to have engagement on a small scale while on the big issues. And in Jersey, this is the demographic shift they're looking at. So 2010, this is how many, the distinction of old people, working age, and children. And 2040, you see that if the population of Jersey remains the same, 100,000 people, then there's going to be 25% less people contributing taxes in 2040. And that's a big problem. And the politicians know it's a problem. The civil servants know it's a problem. They know what the options are. They know it's about increased labor immigration, raising the age of retirement, possibly cutting public spending. But none of these, they also know that none of these options are popular ones. They know that if they just do a regular consultation, an opinion survey, members of the public will say no to all of them. This is a key example of a difficult trade-off. So we decided to go in and do a deliberative process. A process where instead of citizens talking one-on-one to the government and saying this is our demand, they talked amongst themselves about what they wanted for the island. And I remember it was a very heated debate. I remember one particular instance when citizens stood up and questioned one of the questions we'd put in and said, well, I actually think this is wrongly formulated. So it was a very robust conversation, which I think is one of the benefits. And this is just another example of the increasing cost. I think there's something here, though, about, and Kuba, I think you alluded to it in your start, about the changing nature of what's needed from us as people who support participation. From my perspective, in the 1990s, the challenge we had was getting anyone to do any participation processes. It was actually about developing the methods and getting people with power to say, yeah, I'm going to try this. I'm going to try at a school level or at a hospital level to get some patients or pupils or citizens involved to make a small decision. Because I'm a bit worried. I'm not sure this is going to work. And in the 90s in the UK, we showed this does work and it can function. In the 2000s, in the first decade of the 21st century, the focus was really about scaling it. Yes, sure, you can do it with 25 people, the skeptics would say, but we need to engage 100, we need to engage 200, we need to engage 2,000 people. This won't work. It works on the small level, it doesn't work on the big level. And in the first decade of the 21st century, the noughties, as we call them in England, a lot of experiments were done. Organizations like America Speaks went out and they engaged 3,000 people on what to do with the World Trade Center site after 9/11. They engaged 3,000 or 4,000 people in New Orleans about what to do after Katrina. They engaged 8,000 people in 5 different locations on the same day in an in-depth deliberation using modern technology on the future of California, and California Speaks. So the big challenge of that decade, I think, has been largely met. We know that the idea that somehow meaningful, in-depth participation is limited to only a few hundred people. It's not true. If we have the resources, we can do it. I think in this decade, the challenge is different. It's actually about institutionalizing public participation. Of course, that doesn't, we still have to make the case. There's a lot of people that need to be convinced. But the big challenge is moving away from participation being one-off projects into participation becoming how things are done. And I just wanted to, this may be something that you're all well aware of, but I just wanted to show it. Oftentimes we start with the method, the process, the how. A citizens' jury, a Facebook group, a written consultation. We start with the method. And that's where I think we end up wrong, because we think the method will give us what we want. But in order to get to where we want to get to, you need to understand the purpose. What am I trying to do here? Because you can use participation for many reasons. You need to understand the context. Where am I doing this? What's the background? What's the history? The different towns can have completely different contexts. You need to, of course, understand your participants. If I'm engaging with a school class of kindergartners, or a group of university students, or a group of unemployed young people, or a group of old age pensioners, or a group of hard-working professionals of varying ages like yourselves, my decision will be very different. And only when I know these things can I decide how I'm going to engage. Maybe Facebook works well for you guys. It might not work as well for the old age pensioners. And then we can get to the point we want to get to. And I think this is a lesson which has been learned the hard way in the National Health Service. So I'm going to talk about 3 examples of engagement in the National Health Service. And I haven't picked the ones that necessarily worked, because I think we talk about good practice case studies, but I think there's a lot to be learned from the bad practice case studies. So I'm going to talk, firstly I'm going to talk about the structures, representative structures. The abolished signs were supposed to show up first. In the UK in the 70s, the health service created something called community health councils. Community health councils were not particularly, they were groups of citizens. You could volunteer for it and you could step into this council and you were meant to advise your local hospital. And so the hospital was meant to ask you, what do you think of the service? But it was very tokenistic. It was very sort of, once a year the Community Health Council writes to the hospital says thank you very much, and then they put it in they filed it if you were lucky, or it went straight into the shredder. There was no real structure. So in the early 2000s, they created the patient and public involvement forums. And these were meant to have a bit more bite and a bit more power. But many of the same people went from the community health councils into the patient and public involvement forums. But within 2 or 3 years, they decided to abolish these as well. Why did they do that? Well, because the idea was this first group was seen as being very unrepresentative. People said it's only white, old, retired men in these councils, and we want to have the patient and public involvement forums will be more diverse. And it turned out that they weren't. So instead they created something called local involvement networks. And along the way they also had a commission for patient and public involvement in health and the NHS Centre for Involvement, and both of those were also dissolved. In part, of course, because participation, as you all know in your work, is really quite contentious. It's really quite something that a lot of people are against it, and so there's a lot of opposition. But the local involvement networks have now become something called Local Health Watch. So let's assume that I was an active citizen in the early 2000s. In the course of a decade, I have seen 1, 2, 3, and now a 4th healthcare structure. And as you can imagine, a lot of people have dropped by the wayside. So why has this, clearly this is not a successful model, but why has it not been successful? Well, I think there's a few problems with these permanent structures. One is the UK has made it very centralized. The centre has said every hospital must have this structure and it must look like this. And actually, one of the problems they had was that some hospitals were way ahead. Some of the hospitals had another group that was much better designed for their local context. But the Department of Health said, no, you must change that group to what we have decided. So it was a very inflexible system. It was very inflexible as well because it was built around the bureaucracy and not around the citizen. So in Britain there's the distinction between primary and secondary care. So the hospital and your local doctor are two different administrative systems. And so in this system you had to choose. Do you want to get involved with your local hospital or do you want to get involved with your local doctor? But of course for the average citizen that's a divide which doesn't make any sense. It's all the healthcare system. It's all part of my experience of my health. So it was these permanent structures became very inflexible. They also were over-promoted. People promised too much. In their drive to get people to join the structures, they said, have your say, you'll have a real opportunity to change the way the healthcare system was. So a lot of people joined these structures thinking, these structures are going to, I'm going to be able to do visits, you know, unannounced visits to a hospital, so I can see for my own eyes what this hospital does, what they're not doing well. I should be able to write to the authorities and demand answers. But actually the powers that these structures were given didn't correspond to the promises that were made. They were very watered down. And I think this is a very important point about participation, that if we have a very weak structure, we need to manage people's expectations. The other thing that was said, and I said before, is this point about unrepresentative. There was an expectation that these forums should represent the whole community, but in the end it turned out to mainly be pensioners who showed up. But I think that's an unfair criticism, because these structures took time. If you sign up to one of these structures, the expectation is you will go to at least one meeting a month on an evening. You will spend lots of time talking about healthcare decisions, maybe going to other meetings with doctors or with the hospital administration. And I mean, how many of you would feel that you have time in your daily lives to do that? How many of you might feel like that when you're retired? Yeah, so it's unsurprising. Of course, a structure which is set up to be very demanding, to be quite difficult. You have to, if you're going to be talking directly to doctors and administrators, that requires a certain self-confidence, maybe a certain education. So the criticism is actually unfair. They chose the wrong method for what they were trying to achieve. And also, an important lesson here is they didn't give these structures time to develop. The patient and public involvement forums were only around for around 3 years. And I'd say if you set up a structure, it probably needs 5 years before you know, is this working or not? How many people here have heard about the participatory budget in Porto Alegre, as an example? How many of you knew that in the first year of the participatory budget, the number of administrators and city officials was often higher than the number of public participants at the meetings? I mean, in England, that would have been scrapped right there. It would have been like, oh, this is hopeless, it's not working. But trust takes time. In Porto Alegre, it was a case of people saying, why did that neighborhood get paved roads? And he said, well, they came to the participatory budgeting meeting. You guys didn't. So next year, they made sure they showed up. Trust takes time. And so if you set up a structure, give it time to mature. That's the lesson there. So that's the permanent structures. I think those are important, but they don't really solve some of the bigger issues about representativeness. In 2000, actually almost 10 years ago, 2006, 5 or 6, the NHS held Your Health, Your Care, Your Say, which was the first. I think it's a groundbreaking process in England. Because this was a discussion about the big issues in healthcare on a national level. And it was a deliberative process. Citizens were randomly or sort of selected on a stratified sample So there was 50% men, 50% women. They had the right proportion of young people, people from all over the country came together over 2 days in Birmingham. 1,000 people were there to talk about their experiences. The one thing they did, which wasn't demographically correct, was that they oversampled. They included more people with chronic conditions than should have been there according to statistics. And they did that because they felt that these are people who use the health service disproportionately. They are people whose voice we should hear more from. So it's a very ambitious process, and actually a very different process from what from these permanent structures. One of the things to say about this is, on the day, Your Health, Your Care, Your Say was incredibly successful. They used electronic voting pads, they had small group discussions, and they asked the participants, what did you think of the process? And around 85% of the participants were happy or very happy with the process. They felt like they'd been heard, they felt like they understood the issues, and they felt like it was a real opportunity to get engaged. And yet, Your Health, Your Care, Your Say didn't have the full impact it could have. And this is, I think, because it was a one-off project. I mean, it was a big deliberation. It proved in the UK that you can have a proper, meaningful conversation on complex topics with 1,000 people. People were happy on the day. The quality was good. And it actually had influence. When they asked the civil servants, did this make a difference? They said, yeah, in this policy paper, this, and this changed because of this event. Do you think the participants knew that? No. Most participants, when they asked, said, did it make a difference? I don't know. No one told me. And this is a fundamental problem when you have participation in decision making. And that is that every politician, every civil servant likes to be the person who listens. But no one likes to admit that they changed their mind. But if no one admits they changed their mind, then why would you participate in the process? So there needs to be a much clearer feedback. And of course, the big problem with this is it was expensive and it was a one-off event. It wasn't part of a systematic change of the NHS. So I'm going to now talk about a third project, which is just beginning to yield results. So it's hard to talk about the big impacts, but I think it's a very interesting contrast in how far we've got. And this is NHS Citizen, which is a new process. So the National Health Service, this is a bit of bureaucratic background which I still think is relevant, used to be directly linked to the Department of Health. And they have now made it what they call an arm's length body. So it no longer directly responds to the minister, it responds to its own board. Now this has created a bit of a democratic problem for the National Health Service, because in the past when someone criticized them, they could always say, the minister made me do it. Not me, the minister, he's elected, it's fine. They can't do that now. So they're actually taking a good hard look at how do we show that the decisions we make about what was it you said, Peter, that the NHS is the second largest public sector employer in the world after North Korean Army. I don't know if that's a good or a bad company to be in. But it's a huge organization and makes huge decisions, and it has a massive impact on 60 million people's health. So it's a big deal. So they need to show that this is somehow democratically accountable. And they could have gone down the route of something like the local involvement networks, a permanent structure of a self-selected group of people who come together once or twice a year to talk, and it's a bit of it's not really that in-depth and interesting. What they've actually gone and done is a much more complex structure. It's a 3-layer structure, which I will go through. At the center, you have the assembly, which is twice a year and which directly advises the board. And the board are going to be present at these meetings. And at the moment, because this is still being designed, we're in a really interesting discussion where we're talking about who is at this assembly. Is this a space for stakeholders, patient groups, organized interests, the people who really understand the issues and can sort of help the board to think through complex issues? Or should it be a representative sample of citizens? Now, the citizens won't be able to get into those complex issues, but they will be able to tell the board what they think. Where is public opinion? Or does it need to be a combination? And that is a debate which is ongoing right now, because this is a design process which is very, very participative. And I'll talk about that in a moment. So at the center there is a physical participation where you can talk face-to-face directly with board members, the people who will make decisions. The second is the gather level. And this is a very flexible space where if a certain issue comes up, the NHS citizen can then commission an event like Your Health, Your KSA, or a focus group, or a survey, or some other participative method designed for this process, which, let's say diabetes suddenly becomes a big issue. Then we can organize a targeted participation intervention to find out more about what the public think about this issue, what the issues are. It gathers evidence, it sets the agenda for the assembly, it allows citizens to push forward things, and it structures the discussion. Because twice a year you have this meeting, that's not enough on its own. You need to have something which allows you to find out what people are thinking, to engage, to deliberate between them. And in the outer rim is a really interesting issue. The NHS has started talking about the conversations about us, without us. A big organization like the NHS, every year there are millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of conversations about health services that the National Health Service knows nothing about. The conversations people have on Facebook, on Twitter, at kitchen tables, in community groups. And all this is valuable information which the health service actually needs to know about. So work is at the moment being done to start to aggregate. It's easier online, of course, to aggregate what is written, what is said on one platform, on one space where policymakers can look at it, engage with it, because it's an important piece. And this is very complicated, very difficult. Involve is predominantly working on the assembly part. There's an organization called Public Eye which is doing the discovery level. But these three layers create a much more complex structure. Of course, that increases the risk of failure, but it also allows this structure to do much, much more. As I said, this has been going on for about a year and we're still designing it. The reason that's taken so long is normally participation processes are like a black box. You don't know what happens in the box. The participation practitioner is like a magician. They put something in the box and then they pull out a participation process and say, here, it's a rabbit. No, it's a participation process. Take part in it. We are actually trying to build something in the light. So every decision we make about how to structure those three levels is being discussed with stakeholders, with citizens, in physical meetings, but also importantly, we're webcasting those meetings. We're bringing questions asked by viewers online into the physical meetings. We have NHS board members in those meetings to directly respond to these issues. And in some ways, this is an incredibly painful way to design a participation process for someone who's used to just getting on with it. Because, you can create a participation process in a few weeks. But I think this is really important. Because if we go back to the previous slide, you can see that a lot of people have been disappointed with participation in the NHS. We have 15 years of a lot of people being very disappointed. They don't have any trust, and that trust takes time to build, just like in Porto Alegre. So I think this building the structure up front is a really important thing to do, partly because it's healthcare, and partly because we practice what we preach. We're not just saying participation is important, but we're not going to let you participate in the design of your democratic structure. We're directly involving people in those critical decisions. So as I said, it's a little bit too soon to say the assembly has done X, Y, or Z, because actually the first year or two of the assembly is about designing the assembly and tweaking and changing and experimenting. It's a model that we've taken from the software development, And rather than developing a prototype behind closed doors and running with it until it's finished and then launching it, we've launched the assembly in beta mode. And now people are commenting, they're changing, and maybe it'll be like Google, constantly in beta mode. We'll always be changing and tweaking and adapting the assembly because it'll never be perfect. Democracy is never perfect, as was said yesterday. So that's a little bit about the assembly. And I thought I would pause at this point and take any questions that people might have about the structures that I've talked about, or the experience in the UK with healthcare or otherwise.
Okej. Ja zrozumiałem, tak mi się wydaje, zasadę działania, ale chcę dopytać się o tą ostatnią grupę, tak? Czyli ten rodzaj platformy. Czy to spełnia też rolę pewnego rodzaju forum?
Sorry, I think I missed the last.
Aha.
Sorry, can you repeat the last bit of your question? I missed that.
Jeszcze. Czy ta platforma może być pewnego rodzaju forum, tak, dla osób wypowiadających się? Czy te osoby również dostają informację zwrotną? Dają temat i to nie jest tylko wrzucenie kamyczka, tylko czy dostają również tą informację ewentualnie, czy ta informacja może być gdzieś też komentowana przez innych?
Well, I think one of the good things about the NHS Assembly meeting so far is having the board members there in person, because they can then immediately respond in the meeting with their thoughts. The fact that the Assembly is held twice a year actually means that I think a lot of the push for feedback is going to come from participants themselves, because it's much harder to ignore an issue if it's much easier to ignore it if it's a one-off process. But if you know you have to go back to the same people 6 months later, then it becomes a much more complex, difficult one. Do you have additional comments?
Tak, bo wydaje mi się, że jak gdyby ja nie o to się pytałem, tak? Ja nie pytałem się o zgromadzenie, tylko o ten szeroki krąg, o ten ostatni krąg.
Sorry. Okay, sorry. That, I think, is up for discussion. I think the difficulty there is actually that a lot of the time, because obviously there's privacy issues as well. You could, on one level, you could sort of scrape everything on the internet and pull in, what everyone is saying about the NHS. But what we also know from the way some corporate companies are using Twitter is British Airways, for example. If you are in their first class lounge and you tweet something, oh, they're late again, or this is typical, they can see where you're tweeting from. So they might approach you in person and say, is there anything we can do? And a lot of people find that a bit freaky and feel that that's surveillance. So I think that needs to be the right to have to complain about a service and not feel that automatically has to be fed into the watchful eyes of the people running that service. I think is important. But I think it is important that there is some way of showing, even if we can't account for everything that happens in discovery, what I think is really important is that we show the connections between what is found out in discovery, what goes into collect, and what goes to the assembly. Because the people in discovery are far too distributed to be able to hold us to account. There are people who are busy, they might just be tweeting occasionally, they might be Facebooking occasionally. The people at the center, at the assembly, the stakeholders, the active patients, they are the people who have the time and the inclination to hold the system to account. So I think that's where I would look for accountability and feedback in the primary case. So I had a hand over, pass it there. Is there anyone else?
Takim brytyjskim ciałem, które nas tutaj fascynuje i zachwyca, To jest Citizens Council działające przy NICE, przy National Institute of Clinical Excellence. Ten instytut to jest takie ciało bardzo analityczne, które podejmuje decyzje o tym, co finansować ze środków publicznych w ochronie zdrowia, a co nie. I tam podejmowane są decyzje na podstawie bardzo takiej analitycznej oceny, czy jakaś terapia jest opłacalna ekonomicznie, czy nie. I to ciało w jakimś momencie, proszę mnie poprawić, jeśli się mylę, uznało, że jedynie takie analityczne kryteria podejmowania decyzji nie są wystarczające, dlatego że one nie uwzględniają w ogóle wartości społecznych. I powstało ciało złożone z 20 obywateli, zupełnie niezwiązanych z systemem ochrony zdrowia, którzy są odzwierciedleniem przekroju społecznego w zakresie płci, wieku, rasy, wykształcenia, profilu zawodowego, także tam mogą się znaleźć dyrektorzy przedsiębiorstw, ludzie bezrobotni, chorzy, zdrowi, opiekunowie, wszyscy, po prostu przekrój społeczny. I oni zostali obarczeni takimi obowiązkami wypowiadania się na temat wartości w zdrowiu. I naprawdę podejmują się bardzo trudnych działań, bo odpowiadają na przykład na takie pytania, kogo leczyć i jak leczyć. Czy mamy leczyć niepełnosprawność, czy mamy tych niepełnosprawnych nie tylko leczyć, ale również przywracać ich do pracy. Czy mamy leczyć terminalną postać choroby nowotworowej, czy mamy w jakimś momencie przestać to leczyć. I to ciało jest takim bardzo dobrym przykładem, dlatego że ono w tej naszej perspektywie spowodowało, że ten brytyjski system podejmowania decyzji zmienił orientację z takiej stricte analitycznej, opartej o wskaźniki ekonomiczne, w kierunku modelu mieszanego, w którym uwzględnia się kryteria nie tylko ekonomiczne, ale również wartości społeczne. Ja się chciałam zapytać, czy Brytyjczycy są zadowoleni z tego modelu i z tej ewolucji systemu, który się dokonał i czy to ciało w jakiś sposób ma jakieś, że tak powiem, cieszy się jakimś uznaniem i jest dostrzegane jako taki element istotny w tym procesie.
I think that the NICE Citizens Panel is a really valuable citizen engagement process, and what's valuable about it is also that it's been going for a long time. They've let it take time to develop. It's also especially impressive because it's a process which is on something so complex and something which in other areas would be seen as something for the experts. This is somewhere where health economics, you could say, is too complicated for the public. What's good about NICE is they have really understood that when it comes down to it, the decision about what to fund is an ethical decision. It's not a decision that the health economists can make on their own. So it's a powerful structure. It's made a lot of difference to NICE's decision making. The difficulty is actually that it's not very well understood by the public at large. And if say a decision is made to not fund a particular type of cancer treatment, oftentimes the campaign groups, the pharmaceutical companies, patient groups will go to the media and start a conversation or start a campaign to bring back these. It can be a very difficult conversation to have. So there is an element of lobbying in this, and in that lobbying conversation and the conversation that the media has, I think that the citizens panel isn't well understood. And so there is an educational aspect. I think the media in Britain and probably in Poland doesn't understand what participation is and how it works. So I think the citizens panel works well as a decision-making, as helping decision-making. In terms of raising public trust in that system, I think there needs to be more promotion for it to do that. That's my verdict. Did we have any further questions? We have one down here.
I want to get back to that process that you were talking about, and I was wondering how are the representatives of patients chose from the public in case of the core of that participation process, the assembly, because you said that if there's going to be a group of patients, then if those are the leaders of some local patient groups, how they are chosen?
At the moment, this is very much a kind of stakeholder process, because we are aware there are a lot of groups who've been around for decades and worked hard at influencing health. We know that there are a lot of people who've been involved in these patient participation groups throughout, since the 70s in some cases. And a lot of these people are very angry about how the NHS has engaged so far. So their involvement and their buy-in to this process is absolutely crucial. So at the moment, it's actually a very open process. We advertise the meetings, and you can say, I would like to participate, and if we run out of room, we run out of room, and that's an issue of first come, first served. So we have these meetings with in some cases, hundreds of stakeholders talking to each other and debating issues. And I think in one of the meetings, we had something like 900 people following it through webcasts, and somewhere about 100 of those engaged with the process through their tweets or through Facebook and as that in. So at the moment, it's very open. In the future, when the assembly develops, the decision may be made that it needs to be more representative somehow, and then there might be a selection process. But at the moment, we're having a really interesting and really fruitful discussion about, is the assembly primarily a stakeholder process where patient groups representing different illnesses come together? Or is it better to go down the route of randomly selecting citizens to account for the diversity of views, including the people who don't normally get involved? And I think there's a really interesting challenge here, because the answer is, of course, it depends. If you're discussing a particular type of cancer care, then it makes a lot of sense to involve the users directly. Picking someone off the street and saying, what do you think about this care, is like, I don't know, why should I have a say about this? But if we're talking about resource allocation, how much money of public health funds should go to cancer treatment and how much goes to diabetes and how much goes to something else, then just engaging the heavy users of the system can be dangerous, because we all have a stake in the budgetary issues. So I think that at the moment it's open. We'll see where it goes in the future. And I'll take this question, and then, if it's okay, I'll move on to talk a little bit about institutionalizing.
Okej, to będzie bardzo krótko. Takie być może bardzo proste pytanie, ale jak to się dzieje, że tak wiele osób jest zaangażowanych, udaje się zaangażować? I to osób, które, tak jak powiedziałeś wcześniej, nie są bezpośrednio zainteresowane na przykład jakąś kuracją z powodu swojej choroby. I to jest pierwsze pytanie, a drugie pytanie trochę z metapoziomu. Ja trochę się boję brytyjskich przykładów, tak zwanych dobrych praktyk, dlatego że Wielka Brytania ma zupełną inną kulturę dyskusji. I jakby kulturowo, tak, jest o wiele lepiej przygotowana, tak mi się wydaje, niż Polska do tego typu debat. I jak uważasz, na ile ta kulturowe wartości mają wpływ na to, że to jest taki sukces?
It's difficult for me to comment about Polish culture and Polish values. Yes, culture does play a role. Some cultures have a different way of debating than others. And I think possibly part of the response to that is to structure the designs differently. If I want to avoid a lot of conflict, I'll minimize the time spent in plenary. Smaller groups generally tend to mean less aggressive outbursts. But then maybe there's a cultural thing that the groups have to be a little bit smaller in Poland to deal with the culture, or maybe they need to be different. I mean, Peter and I were talking that some cultures, you almost have to give people ask them directly, like, what do you think? And then they'll respond. In other cultures, they're very, very, very open. And I've forgotten your first question, so if you repeat that one.
Jak to się stało, że jest tak wiele osób zaangażowanych? Jak to się stało, że tak wiele osób jest zaangażowanych i to ludzi, którzy nie są jakby bezpośrednio zainteresowani z racji na przykład swojej choroby?
Well, one of the, I mean, the deliberative processes like your health theory say, oftentimes there is some kind of incentive. That can be monetary, or it can be some other form of benefit. It's often necessary to bring people in who are genuinely would never get involved because they're not interested. Another way is, of course, doing informal engagement, where you engage with people where they are, in shopping centers, in pubs, in schools, because then you can reach people who you wouldn't otherwise get to. Health is in some ways easier than other areas because most people have some kind of connection to health. I'd say school education is one where it's harder to get people of a certain age involved because they just don't see any relevance to them. A lot of people have a lot of emotion attached to health. They have direct experiences themselves or with loved ones. That makes it easier to engage them, but also it creates its own challenges because it's very emotive, and people can get very angry and very sad and have a lot invested in the process. So I think the answer to that question is complex, but it comes down to, if there are people that you can't engage, you can't get to come to meetings, then try to go to them, and try to tap into networks. And also, going back to this point about Porto Alegre, it takes time. The first meetings may be very empty, but if we can give it time, we can build up trust, we can show that it delivers results and feedback, then we might see that the numbers increase. So I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about the institutionalization of participation. So Einstein said, or did he? Because never ever try to verify good quotes you find, because you'll always find that it was never the famous person who said it, but someone else. So Einstein probably didn't say, but he's commonly attributed to Einstein, that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. So why is it that we see so many participation processes which succeed on the day? On the day, everyone is really happy. It's really fun, it's really engaging, and then it doesn't lead to any results. Why does that keep happening? Just bad luck? No. It comes down to culture. It comes down to the fact that organizations are very different. The other week, I was doing an event in Malmö on urban farming, where I asked the question of city employees and urban farmers, if the city was a plant, what kind of plant would it be? And they said it's like an oak. Some people said it's like a lawn, a very dull kind of lawn, which is just a monoculture. But some people said it's like an oak, it's always been there, it's very stable, it doesn't change much, and it doesn't really bear any edible fruit. Or if it does bear fruit, it takes a long time to get going. And the city employees said, well, urban farmers, they're like wheat, they're like your dandelions. They pop up everywhere. You never know where they're going to come from. We find it really hard to keep up with them. The culture of public administration often finds it very difficult to deal with the concept of participation. I'm an expert. Why should I listen to other people who aren't experts? These decisions are really difficult, really complex. The citizens can't understand them. And anyway, they just want us to get out there and do things. They're not interested in talking. They just want good services. So there's an uphill battle to convince people. And I've seen a number of interventions tried in the UK. The last 10, 15 years have been full of attempts to get participation to become part of daily working. And I'm going to talk about training, centers of excellence, and codes of practice. So training. The skills that you need to be a good facilitator are not the skills that you were recruited for as a public official. In fact, when they did a study in the American Park Service, the National Park Service, what happened when they introduced participation, they discovered that the divorce rates shot up and the unhappiness at work. Because why might you decide you want to become a park warden in the national park? Is it because you love being in front of lots of people? No. Maybe it's because you don't like people that much. You like animals better, and you like being in the great outdoors. So putting people in front of a room full of angry citizens can be a recipe for disaster. There needs to be skills built. People need to build competencies. Listening is actually a skill that most people think they're really good at, and most of us, myself included in many moments, are not very good, because we're constantly thinking about what we're going to say instead of actually genuinely picking up on what people are saying. So we need to develop skills. Unfortunately, I think the traditional classroom-based learning is not really good at building skills for participation. The ways that have been more successful are things like peer learning or action research, where people learn on the job, they learn with colleagues, you network. It's a much more participative form of learning, and it's a learning over a longer period. And some institutions like the British Environment Agency have really done a lot of this work by setting up networks of staff and given them space and time to develop those skills. The other thing is centers of excellence. Where do you go to if you need to talk to someone about participation? There might be think tanks like Involve, but government has also set up centers of excellence, including in Canada, in Edmonton. The city has funded a center of excellence for participation, which gives its services to city employees for free and sells services to surrounding cities and municipalities. So the city is actually seeing this as a business opportunity because it thinks that its surrounding councils will need help as well. And in the UK, there's ScienceWise, which deals with science and innovation. There's a participatory budgeting unit, which has now become a network. It used to be a formal support unit. There was the Centre for Involvement in the NHS, Participation Works, which is very focused on youth participation, and they have a lot of free resources. So I'd really recommend looking at Participation Works website. There was the International Centre of Excellence for Local E-Democracy, and we also have Participation Cymru, which works in Wales. So there's lots of places to go for support. And I think it can be good to set these centres up. They don't have to be particularly advanced, but they can be really useful, especially like the health one or something else, which is very targeted on one thing. So it's clear what you're getting. And then we have codes of practices. Written laws, written rules, guidelines. These things tend to be where people go first. They say, well, we need to have it in the law. It needs to be mandated. And my experience with codes has been quite mixed, really. On one hand, it's a good thing. We want this to become standard practice. So it needs to be in the systems. It needs to be something which is measured. If your boss doesn't ask you, how much engagement have you done in the last year, then chances are you might not do that much engagement. There's a saying in Britain that what gets measured gets done. But there's also a counterpoint, which is that oftentimes what happens when you start measuring something is that it gets manipulated. In the UK, we had a rule that was the 12-week rule for consultation. The rule said, at a minimum, written consultation should last at least 12 weeks, and it should be, and it should take into account public holidays and other periods which are very busy. Now that's what it said. How many weeks do you think the great majority of consultations took?
Last 5 days.
12 weeks. Because you know, what was meant to be a minimum standard effectively became the de facto maximum. Because it says we have to do 12 weeks. No, it doesn't. It says you should do a minimum. This is the problem with written strict codes, is that they sometimes are followed to the letter but not the meaning. So I think that the codes are necessary, they need to be there, but let's not kid ourselves that a written document is going to change culture. For the culture change, we need to do the training, we need to do we need to expose colleagues for this way of working. Hearing people talk about participation is only so good, but seeing it in action can really make a big difference. So these are a few things that I would point to being successful. A strict kind of codex, this is what it must be, I don't think will work. But a more flexible competency framework will be helpful. Allowing people to build skills on the job, supporting people to support each other is a really important part of this. Because these skills, I think have to be, we can't really teach people participation through top-down measures. It has to be something which is also grown in an organic fashion. So at that point, I think we've got about 10 minutes left, is that? So I think maybe just turn to someone next to you for just a minute or two. What do you think would be helpful in terms of supporting participation in Poland right now? If we wanted, in 10 years' time, if we want this to be common practice, what could we do today which would make a difference? So we'll do it for a minute or two, and then I'll just take a few ideas from the group. Begin. Edward. Yes. Yeah, no worries.
Wiesz co, to, że baza dobrych praktyk jest, uważam, niezbędna.
Tego trochę powstaje, które widziałeś.
Tak, na tej bazie robimy więcej eksperymentów. Stąd zaproszenia ludzi też i od Was, z Łodzi. Szukamy rozwiązań. Przez bazę dobrych praktyk próbujemy coś zmieniać i zmieniamy, wprowadzając dobre przykłady. Natomiast ma być to jedyny sposób, nie jestem pewien. Ale powinno robić też coś na zasadzie regulacji. Opracujemy. On jest priorytetna, inaczej my go opracujemy, jest priorytetna.
A na ile on sam jest
streaming to hear what they're saying, right? For one moment.
Well, actually, maybe we just we'll pull it back together to the plenary because we're running out of time. So who's got the microphone? Ah, perfect. So, who has something they'd like to share with the group? Anyone? You need 2 minutes. I know, we've only got 10 minutes. Okay. Let's
Zmiana postawy z rywalizacyjnej na kooperującą pozwoli szkolenia.
Okay, everyone, let's bring it back together. So we have a comment here.
Yeah.
Okay, everyone. Okay. Always a good sign when people don't listen to the facilitator. I know, it is a very short time. So, take it away.
My tak po tej krótkiej dyskusji doszliśmy do wniosku, że największą aktualnie bolączką, która nas dotyka w Polsce i co może... To powiem jeszcze raz w takim razie. Po krótkiej tutaj dyskusji doszliśmy do wniosku, że największą bolączką jakby uniemożliwiającą zakorzenienie się na dobre procesów partycypacji w Polsce jest po prostu odpowiednich postaw w społeczeństwie, brak wykształtowanej takiej kultury współpracy i postawy obywatelskiej. Więc jakby wydaje mi się, że pierwsze, co powinniśmy zrobić, to podjęcie szerokich działań edukacyjnych mających na celu zbudowanie jakby tych postaw, nauczenie kooperacji, ponieważ jakby mimo, że to, co silnie działa w Polsce, to są takie działania partycypacyjne skierowane przeciwko czemuś, tak, w proteście. I oczywiście jest w tym wartość, ponieważ no, to też jest głos obywateli, który może prowadzić do czegoś konstruktywnego. Natomiast brakuje, wydaje mi się, właśnie takich postaw, w których faktycznie moglibyśmy współpracować w większych grupach. Tak jak ten model, który zaprezentowałeś wcześniej, no on jest bardzo imponujący i myślę, że bardzo inspirujący.
Na koniec, że wiara w to, że w każdym jest siła ekspercka, tak? To, że jestem człowiekiem, że funkcjonuję w społeczeństwie, daje mi prawo wypowiadania się w najbliższym otoczeniu, jak chcę żyć, z kim chcę żyć, jak ma wyglądać to otoczenie.
Thank you. I mean, I think in the UK, our research shows that most people start their long-term engagement by a negative experience. it's really, we all need to get better at making that bridge between being angry about something and then turning that into a constructive thing. But I think participation is a school for building those skills, both in the UK and elsewhere. Here's another comment.
Ja mam dwa komentarze. Jeden taki, który myśmy tutaj sobie wydyskutowały, że problem z takimi dużymi procesami jest taki, że tak jak w samorządzie jest jeszcze taka, jestem z samorządu, może dlatego tak mówię, jest pewna świadomość tego, że trzeba prowadzić dyskusje, nawet dotyczące pewnych strategii czy kierunków. Nawet jeżeli to nie jest prowadzone, to jest taka świadomość, że to w którymś momencie będzie musiało być zaczęte. Natomiast na poziomie rządowym według mnie absolutnie nie ma takiej świadomości i w dodatku jest takie pewne zadowolenie z tego, co jest. I na poziomie rządowym są prowadzone pewne procesy teoretycznie włączające i one są potem przedstawiane jako duże sukcesy bez żadnej refleksji. A druga, to jest trochę odpowiedź do Was. Ja mam takie wrażenie, że taka edukacja na sucho w ogóle nie ma sensu. Znaczy, jedyną możliwością edukacji jest prowadzenie po prostu procesów partycypacyjnych, w których ludzie, dobrych procesów partycypacyjnych, w których ludzie będą mieli szansę zobaczyć, że warto. I to też znowu jest pewnie zadanie dla samorządów i dla organizacji pozarządowych, żeby dużo takich procesów uruchamiać i przez to uczyć ludzi.
I think we're out of time for any more comments. But I'm looking forward to talking to you after this. What I just wanted to say is the best examples of citizenship training in schools in England are ones that teach children to be challenging democratic citizens. But it requires teachers to be confident enough to accept challenge, which again, it's about changing people's view of themselves. We've only got a couple of minutes, and I'm going to, you said we shouldn't quote Churchill so much, but here's another one. We need to find new ways of listening, and we need to redefine what good leadership and courage is. And I kind of didn't quite finish my conversation about the, there's a few things I just wanted to point out. One is my dad used to build wells in Africa as he was international development. And one of the big problems was people liked building the wells. They didn't like maintaining them. You know, you like to spend money building something new, we don't like maintaining it. But someone already said yesterday, bad participation is like a well that's not maintained. It actually makes people angrier. Because before they didn't have a well, now they have a well that doesn't work. If you promise them participation and then fail to deliver, they'll be angrier than they were without it. So if we do it well. The second is, the basic principle is, if you actually know what you want, don't ask a question. If you don't want to know the answer to a question, don't ask a question. So many politicians I've seen ask a question thinking they know what the answer is going to be, and then they stand with a real problem on their hands. And finally, going back to the Imagine Jersey process, with all of a sudden we're standing there and the citizens challenge us on our question. They're like, that's the wrong question to ask. And what do? We could have defended the process. We could have just said, no, we're not changing the question. What we did instead completely changed that event about this difficult conversation. We said, okay, let's change the question we're asking you. In real time, so they were saying, well, you're asking us about immigration. But what we really care about is housing. Because you see, when you ask us, do you want more immigration, we're thinking, where are they going to go? We don't want you to build houses on the fields, so we're going to say no to immigration because we think you're going to build houses. But if you ask us the question, would you be willing to accept immigration if the housing goes in the industrial areas, we may be in favor. And so we changed the question. We shared those difficult decisions. Which of these unpopular things would you choose given the change, these difficult choice that has to be made? And actually, what started out as a really difficult event, an event with lots of questioning and challenge, turned out to be a much more cooperative, much more open-ended discussion. And I think that shift happens because we trust people. We're willing to hand over responsibility and trust and adapt our process to the needs that people bring to the table, and willing to co-produce participation. That participation in itself becomes a participatory process. And those are the key lessons that I wanted to share and leave with you today. So before I hand over to Kuba and we go to coffee break, I'd just like to encourage you to do something. Reflect back over this session and the sessions you've listened to yesterday and identify one key insight you've gathered. Not necessarily from what I've said or what someone said here, but just from the whole conference. Find someone you don't know in the coffee break and share that insight with them and see if you can get one of their insights back. It's a pleasure talking at you mainly because of time constraints. I'm looking forward to you talking at me in the coffee break. And I'm now going to hand over to Kuba for some final thoughts.
Brawo, brawo, brawo. No wiecie, ja tylko krótko, bo już musimy kończyć, ale to też znajdę inny cytat Churchilla, Churchill kiedyś powiedział: panowie, skończyły się pieniądze, musimy zacząć myśleć. I to jest bardzo ważny cytat w perspektywie, ale doprowadzi mnie do bardzo poważnego stwierdzenia, jeśli chodzi o służbę zdrowia, bo przed nami to w ogóle jest prawdopodobnie największe wyzwanie w ogóle Europy. To jest demografia, to jest godność umierania, to są koszty tego. Na mniej więcej ostatnie 3 miesiące życia zużywamy około 50% w ogóle budżetu, który przeznaczamy na ochronę w służbie zdrowia. To są bardzo trudne wybory. Ten system tego nie jest w stanie wytrzymać. Będziemy musieli podejmować bardzo trudne decyzje i to, o czym mówiła Ewa, to jest bardzo ciekawa dyskusja o tym, kto jest ekspertem, bo to, że trzeba pamiętać, że eksperci są od tego, jak rzeczy zrobić. Mają szczególne kompetencje. Wybory o charakterze etycznym i moralnym nie są zarezerwowane dla ekspertów. Stąd cała ta konstrukcja, bardziej przypominająca, że tak powiem, proces ławników, jeśli można tak powiedzieć, bo w tej sprawie, tej wrażliwości, jeśli mogę tak powiedzieć, zostaliśmy przez opatrzność, naturę, jakkolwiek równo podzieleni. To jest bardzo ciekawa dyskusja o tym, kim jesteśmy w tym procesie. Natomiast nawiązując do tej polskiej historii, to mam takie osobiste właściwie przemyślenie. Jeśli chodzi o ten pierwszy system struktur kontrolujących, no to mogę powiedzieć, bo dokładnie za 3 dni mamy kolejną Radę Pożytku Publicznego, w której będziemy próbowali odbić pomysł Ministerstwa Zdrowia, żeby wycofać przedstawicieli organizacji pozarządowych, ogólnie rzecz biorąc, z tego, co stanowi rady, te społeczne rady NFZ-u, które istnieją lokalnie. To nie był dobry proces. Ja sam odpowiedzialny byłem za teoretycznie rekrutowanie tych ludzi, ale to jest instytucja, która zarządza chyba 60 miliardami budżetu, więc naprawdę mówimy o dużych pieniądzach. Muszę powiedzieć, że znalezienie osób z naszego środowiska, które chciałyby być w tym, aktywnie by działały, było bardzo trudno, nawet zlokalizowanie ich. Znaczy ten system struktur był jakoś zaprojektowany, ale on w sumie słabo działał. Na pewno nie pomagało temu to i do tej pory nie pomaga, że od przedstawicieli także organizacji pozarządowych wymaga się skończenia kursów na Radę Nadzorczą. To znaczy coś, co jest ciałem generalnie, które ma wypowiadać się w kategoriach różnych. To są kategorie interesu, to są kategorie pewnej wrażliwości społecznej. Traktowane są jako instytucje, które miałyby po prostu kontrolować finanse, ale to nie jest ta funkcja. Z ministerstwem strasznie trudno się rozmawia na temat tego, że to powinny być inne kompetencje. Mam nadzieję, że to się da jakoś obronić, że tam będą i przedstawiciele pacjentów, i przedstawiciele organizacji pozarządowych. Pamiętam w stoczni chcieliśmy zrobić specjalne seminarium dedykowane wewnętrznemu systemowi zarządzania w instytucjach, które ogólnie były stworzone do pomocy, a często są instytucjami przemocy. To dotyczy szpitali, to dotyczy domów pomocy społecznej i tak dalej. Praktycznie nie byliśmy w stanie znaleźć w Polsce przykładów strukturalnego, jeśli mogę tak powiedzieć, powiązania interesów podopiecznych z tymi, którzy ich obsługują. To jest bardzo trudne, ale to jest ta partycypacja zaszyta w instytucjach. Myślę, że ten drugi krok był ciekawy i mi się wydaje, że ta konstrukcja deliberatywna jest możliwa. Ja uczestniczyłem w jednym takim przedsięwzięciu w Stanach, widziałem jedno w Polsce. To nie jest tak, że my mamy gorszą kulturę. Znaczy tam format bardzo dużo narzuca, jeśli mogę tak powiedzieć. Ci ludzie się edukują, ale to nie jest nie do przeprowadzenia. Oczywiście trzeba by mieć jakąś wolę polityczną, żeby taką dyskusję zrobić, bo ona nie jest prawnie wiążąca, no ale musi być jakieś zaproszenie do tego, żeby taką dyskusję przeprowadzić. Natomiast rzeczywiście najbardziej ekscytujący to jest ten system operacyjny, bo to właściwie nie jest jedna odpowiedź, tylko cały uczący się system operacyjny, ta trzecia. I to rzeczywiście jest niezwykle fascynujące. No nie wiem, nie mamy dość czasu, żeby o tym rozmawiać, ale ja cały czas wierzę, że tak jak powiedziałem na początku, że gdybyśmy potrafili nawet zrobić ten drugi krok, czyli taki prawdziwy, nazwijmy to taką krajową deliberację na temat edukacji czy zdrowia, to ludzie mogliby zrozumieć, na czym to wszystko polega. Czy dojdziemy kiedyś do dyskusji takiej narodowej, jeśli mogę tak powiedzieć, o służbie zdrowia? Tego nie wiem, ale wydaje mi się, że koszty jej zaniechania będą ogromne. Będą kosztami buntu społecznego, manipulacji. Czasami to trwa dłużej, nie wiem, ten duński czy skandynawskie przykłady, to jest nawet kilka lat dyskusji, ale to, że Szwedzi, kraj, który uważany jest za ikonę socjaldemokratycznego podejścia do służby zdrowia, po kilku latach jednak na przykład zgodził się na to, na współodpłatność za służbę zdrowia. Ona jest tam chroniona, nikt nie zbankrutuje, ona ma raczej charakter, jeśli mogę tak powiedzieć, higieniczny, ale generalnie coś takiego jest. Spróbujcie w Polsce wprost rozmawiać z politykami na temat konieczności wprowadzenia do tego równania pieniędzy, które i tak płacimy, bo my za służbę zdrowia wszyscy przecież bez przerwy płacimy. Natomiast nie ma tak odważnego polityka, który by powiedział, zróbmy z tego przedmiot narodowej debaty i ustalmy, na jakich warunkach i za co płacimy. I myślę tutaj no właśnie z pewną nadzieją, chociaż jest to bardzo ryzykowne, że powoli trzeba by jakoś przyzwyczajać, że taka debata jest możliwa i spróbować ją jakoś wspólnie wymyśleć, zaprojektować, tak żeby była, no jak mówię, pewnym kanonem, którego później możemy się trzymać. Okej, to mi chyba pozostało wszystkim wam podziękować wobec tego i w szczególności Edwardowi. To było bardzo pouczające. No i rozumiem, że widzimy się na jakichś innych sesjach.